As the JALT Junior Conference Chair, I have been asked to introduce Dr. Yuko Goto Butler. Dr. Butler is a professor of educational linguistics at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also the director of the Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages, TESOL, program at Penn. Her research primarily focuses on the improvement of second and foreign language education among young learners in the U.S. and Asia as well as assessment methods for them in response to diverse needs of an increasing globalizing world. Digital technology changes both the way we learn languages and the way we communicate. It also changes the target language itself. I am sure that today's presentation, the digital generation's language use and abilities, will be of interest to all educators. So now, I would like to express a warm welcome to JALT 2021, Dr. Yuko Goto Butler. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mary, for your beautiful introduction.
Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to have this opportunity to give a talk at the JALT conference. I feel very honored to be invited, and I'd like to thank the organizers to give me this opportunity. So today I'm going to discuss the digital generation's language use and abilities. So there are many different kinds of digital technologies, but I'm going to focus on information and communication technology, or ICT. I use digital technology and ICT interchangeably in this talk. So before I'm going to start, I'd like to ask you some questions. How many email messages do you usually write per day? On average, how much time do you spend reading SNS messages per day? How often do you communicate with your students and colleagues through Zoom, Microsoft Teams, and so forth? In contrast, how many times do you write messages by hand each day? How often do you read text on paper? How often do you call your friends and colleagues by phone each week? Now, you may notice that the way you communicate with others has changed a lot, say, compared with 10 years ago. So digital technology has changed the way we use language. Namely, it changed the target communicative competence. So for example, reading used to be processing linguistic written text. Nowadays, reading often means processing multimodal text, including non-linguistic audio and visual information. Digital technology has also changed the way we learn languages, namely how to learn a language. Tablets are coming into the classrooms, so students and teachers are expected to use them. So we need a completely new way of thinking about language education and communication. So here's the essence of my talk today. What I would like to propose in this talk is that language education in the era of digital technology is to connect language use and cognitive styles among digital generation and communicative competence for the era of digital technology through using digital technology as a means of learning and teaching language. When using digital technology as a tool for teaching and learning, we need to keep in mind at least 3 important elements of human language use. They are embodiment, social interaction, and affect. Well, you may wonder what they are, and you'll find them out in this talk. So in this talk, first, as a background, I'm going to briefly look at how Japanese schools make use of information computer technology, ICT. And second, I'll look at how Japanese children or young people use ICT. And third, What important elements of language use should we keep in mind when we use digital technology as a tool to teach or learn language? And finally, what kind of communicative competence do our children need to develop in the era of digital technology? So first, how do Japanese schools use digital technology? So I'd like to start with PISA, Program for International Student Assessment. Now, since 2000, students at the age of 15 from more than 90 countries and regions have participated in PISA. Since the ranking of PISA is often become a headline news, I'm pretty sure that many of you are familiar with PISA. But what I would like to talk about today is not the ranking of academic achievement. PISA conducted a survey on the use of digital devices for educational purposes. I'd like to draw your attention to this survey result. One of the items in the survey asks students how often they use a computer to do the homework. If you look at the OECD average, close to 50% of the students use a computer either every day, almost every day, or once or twice per week, namely very frequently and regularly. In contrast, close to 80% of Japanese students answered almost never. Here's the use of a mobile device for homework. The situation looks slightly better than the case of computers, but still more than 80% of Japanese students said that they never use a mobile device to do their homework. Similarly, over majority of Japanese students never use a school websites for study. Perhaps Japanese schools did not have any idea of making use of school websites as a learning or instructional tool. Here is a comparison across different developed OECD countries. At the bottom, you see the names of countries. Y-axis indicates the degree of ICT use for educational purposes. The horizontal line running in the middle of the graph is the OECD average. The arrows indicate the range of ICT used by SES, socioeconomic status, so higher SES and lower SES. The longer the arrow means that the larger the disparity between the high SES students and low SES students. As you may guess, this is Japan. Compared with other countries, the use of ICT for educational purposes outside of school is very limited in Japan. And on top of that, the disparities by SES is relatively large as well. So Japanese children do not use ICT for educational purposes. Moreover, disparities by SES are relatively large in Japan. Now, some people may argue that, well, but this is the statistics of 2018 before the COVID-19. So after the COVID-19 pandemic, the situation should have been better. Well, the situation may be better compared with the 2018 data, but we cannot be too optimistic. During the 2020, many countries were forced to close schools due to COVID-19 pandemic. So more than 1.6 billion children in 191 countries were affected in April 2020. And among 44 developed countries, 95% of them conducted online classes. Now, out of them, 43% said the online classes are very effective. 58% said very effective, and there's no negative responses reported. So these figures, by the way, do not include higher education, only the primary and secondary school levels. So other developed countries tended to view the pandemic as providing an opportunity to enhance the use of ICT in school instruction. However, in Japanese public school, at the compulsory levels, grade 1 to grade 9, online classes were rarely offered during the school closure. So as a result, Japanese schools lost a great opportunity to try out online courses and learn about, what works and what doesn't work. The Japanese government decided to introduce a policy called Global and Innovative Gateway for All, like GIGA school concept. Originally, the government was planning to provide tablets to all the students at grade 1 to grade 9 by 2023. The government also planned to promote digital textbooks and offer workshops for teachers. Partially due to COVID-19, the government decided to implement this policy earlier. Although there's no official statistics available, how to make use of tablets appear to differ greatly across schools at this point. So while Japanese schools on average have not yet utilized ICT for educational purposes sufficiently, Japanese children are exposed to digital technology a lot outside of school. So in this talk, I will call children and young people who are born after around 2000 digital generation. Well, there are many terms to call these people, including digital natives, homo digital, digital youth, Generation Z, cyber citizens, netizens, and so forth. But all these terms come and go quickly. So in this presentation, I'll call them a digital generation, although it sounds very generic. Now, here is a potty with a tablet. This potty, as far as I remember, appeared in 2013 in the US. It was sensational at that time, but it was almost 10 years ago. So this is nothing surprising anymore. The point here is the digital generation grown up with digital technology. Here's the rough sketch of the digital use among Japanese children and youth. So they prefer internet to TV. So close to 90% of them use internet during weekdays, like use social media 71 minutes per day, watch YouTube and other videos 60 minutes per day, play online or social games 45 minutes per day. And these are the statistics of weekdays. So over weekends, and people spend more time on these devices. They regularly engage multitasks. So, such as doing homework while they're listening to music, and at the same time, and they're checking chats or SNS and so forth. Now, this is critical. Access internet. They also access internet through a smartphone rather than a computer. More than 90% of them use smartphones. Now, major reasons for using SNS include obtain information that I want to know. This is really critical because they access information that they want to hear, but not others. Also to kill time. So they spend much time on digital technology. But there is limited use of ICT for productive purposes, such as using for studies. Now, this is not a desirable situation, but put it differently, we can say that there's much potential for productive use. Now, here's the use of SNS among Japanese teenagers. As you may expect, Line is the most popular SNS, followed by Twitter. But growth of Instagram, in this case indicated in a light blue line, this is notable. It quickly went up in the last few years. As you know, in Instagram, people mainly exchange pictures and short videos rather than text. Now, here's the case of US teenagers. Among the US teens, Snapchat was popular, but again, Instagram is also popular. In addition, TikTok is also increasingly popular, although it's not included in this graph. TikTok is also a video-based SNS. So among both Japanese and US teens, the video-based rather than the text-based SNS is increasingly popular. So there are some people who are concerned that the students who use SNS extensively may be exposed to less text compared with the previous generations. We're going to get back to that issue later. Now, language that is used in SNS is called text-speak in English. In Japanese, people call it uchikotoba. Here are some examples of text-speak because they come and go very, very quickly. So some of them listed here might have gone already. The point here is that people often place sounds in English text-speak. So as you can see in phonological shortening and substitutions in this table. In Japanese uchikotoba, people often play with letters and orthographies. So text-speak or uchikotoba is a very playful, creative language. They're authentic. But importantly, the text-speak or uchikotoba has unique characteristics, often very different from texts that are used in academic contexts. Then what about the influence of text-speak on students' literacy? In this case, I'm talking about the first language acquisition because we hardly know about the influence on their second language acquisition. Should we use text-speak in classrooms? To be or not to be? This is actual text-speak that I found in the SNS. So empirical results, mostly conducted on English text-speak, are mixed. But there seems to be some tendencies between children, in this case, primary school children, and college students. Which group do you think are most affected by text-speak? Well, you may expect that text-speak influences more on young students since they're still developing literacy skills in their first language. But the results, again, it's mixed, but tended to be positive. The studies tend to show that the use of text-speak can potentially increase a student's phonemic awareness in English. Now, when it comes to college students, again, results are mixed, but tend to show either no effect or negative effect. Well, it seems that the result can be influenced by many factors, including the extent to which students use SNS or the exposure to other types of texts, socioeconomic backgrounds of students, and so forth. But we have to remember that previous studies almost exclusively conducted on English text-speak. We have very little information on other languages, including Japanese. So the impact is still a great debate. Again, this is an actual text-speak that I found in SNS. So you now understand such use of text-speak stimulates your phonetic awareness, right? If you don't have a good phonetic awareness, you cannot create or understand such text speak. Our reading habit is also changing. Among the digital generation, they prefer to read on screen, or you yourself may prefer reading on screen. I don't. But empirical studies have shown that there's no difference in text processing mechanism and comprehension between reading on screen and reading on paper in general. Now, in general here. However, if you have a closer look at the previous studies, there are some subtle differences between reading on screen and reading on paper, at least at this point. So reading on paper appears to be better when reading longer text. When it comes to English, longer than 500 words, or when you're involved in analytical and critical thinking. And people are more accurately assess their own reading performance when they read on paper. This is important because the accurate self-assessment of reading performance is correlated with higher reading performance. So people tend to overestimate their performance when they read on screen. So at this point, it looks like there are some merits of reading on paper, but who knows what will happen in the near future. Now, hyperlinks. Hyperlinks can be useful and can enhance children's comprehension, but it could be a distractor. Not all the links are informative and helpful for your comprehension. If the text has too many hyperlinks, for example, that would negatively influence your comprehension. So strategic use of hyperlinks is very necessary, very important. So it's important to keep in mind that there are substantial individual differences in processing multimodal text as well. So efficiency is quite different across individuals. And this is also a very important point to remember. Now, Prensky in 2001 hypothesized that a game generation is different from pre-game generations. He used the term game generation here, but it is essentially the same as digital generation. Now, number one, game generation is much faster at processing information, so they can quickly dig up information from a large database. Number two, they are also more comfortable with processing multiple information simultaneously or in a parallel fashion rather than a linear fashion. Number three, for older generations, graphics are an aid for comprehension of the text. For the game generation, graphics are no longer subordinate for text. This is important because that would change the way we conceptualize literacy. Number four, the game generation tends to start with multiple sources and process them in less sequential manner or even random fashion. Number five, the game generation is used to be connected with others through email, chats, instant messages, and other devices at any time and anywhere. So due to their experience of being connected all the time, they tend to take different approaches to get information and solve problems. The digital natives are much quicker and sophisticated to master new technology. Oh, by the way, digital natives is the term that Prensky coined, but it is a controversial term in applied linguistics. So we actually try to avoid using that term. But in any event, game generation doesn't start reading users' manuals, right? They just play around the programs and try them out. There are less tolerance with passive learning environments such as lectures. For the game generation, play is work. Play and work are not separated. Number 8, the game generation gets so used to receive rewards at each level of the games. So they have less patience with things that they don't pay off at the level that they expect. Number 9, fantasy and reality may not be clear-cut, as the older generation may think. And finally, and definitely, technology is their friends. So again, this list is based on Prensky's personal observations. So we need more empirical research to really confirm if Prensky's claims are true or not. But I think this is a good starting point for us to better understand the digital generation's cognitive styles and preferred strategies. So there are some potential differences in cognitive styles between game generation and previous generations. But we also should not forget that there are some concerns expressed for the excessive use of digital devices. Some educators and scientists concerned if the excessive use of digital devices can have negative influence on children's well-being and also academic studies. So as I mentioned, the influence of digital devices on academic studies are not yet totally clear. And it looks like there are substantial individual differences as well. So there are some students who understand the merits of digital technology and use it strategically, whereas there are other students who use digital technology passively, or they're used or consumed by digital technology. So because the tablets were distributed all the students in Japan, the quality of use rather than the excess of use appears to be more serious from now on. So summary in this section, basically digital generations are grown up with digital technology. They spend much time on digital technology, but there's limited use for productive purposes. Video-based rather than text-based SNS is increasingly popular among young people. And text-speak used in SNS that is very creative and unique language, but the influence of text-speak on literacy development is inconclusive at this point. There are pros and cons of reading on screen and on paper, and there are potential differences in cognitive styles between digital generation and previous generations. And there are substantial individual differences in multimodal processing. So what matters is how to use ICT. Now, after understanding the characteristics of digital generation, what we need to keep in mind is when we use technology as a tool for language teaching and learning. So first point that we want to keep in mind is that importance of embodiment, or more precisely, the role of human bodies in language use. So gestures or back channel behavior, such as nodding or say during the conversation, and eye gazing. These are critical in human communication. So due to pandemic, many people now have online classes and online meetings, but some people feel tired or uneasy in online communication. This can be partially because people cannot access gestures or back channel behavior sufficiently, especially when the people mute their videos. Embodiment or human bodies plays important role not only in oral conversation, but also reading and writing. So you may recall that when you write things by hands or memorize them before exams, when we read on paper, we often use hands unconsciously. For example, we stick a finger between pages so that we can turn to the next page efficiently. A finger often indicates your eye movement when reading. We also often point some text using pen and you're pointing the text. If you're not allowed to do pointing while you're, say, editing a text, your performance will go down. So how to use your body influences your quality of reading. So use of digital technology should not deprive us of the use of our body. So don't turn off your video at the Zoom meeting. The second point that we want to keep in mind when using digital technology for teaching and learning language is that we use language in social interaction. So babies and young children do not pick up languages very much by simply watching videos or reading digital books alone. So having interaction with adults around the video or digital books is critically important for them to develop language. The central meaning or the purpose of language activities is to interact with others. So it is important to make use of two-way interaction for language learning and instruction. The third point that we want to keep in mind when using digital technology as a tool for language learning and teaching is that we use language not only for the transmission of information, but also for an expression of emotion. So we use language primarily because we want to share our emotion, feeling, and other affects. So currently, AI, artificial intelligence researcher, try to understand a human emotion and incorporate it in AI technology so that AI can read human emotion and respond to it accordingly. But it turns out that reading human emotion is not easy. That relationship between humans, the people's facial expressions or the tone of voices and so forth, and the emotional state is actually very complicated. Humans take a long time to learn how to read others' emotion. Moreover, interestingly, language learning is facilitated when we have positive feeling. So the law of emotion is quite important for language use and language learning. So what we discussed in this section is that there are at least 3 important points that we need to keep in mind when using digital technology as a tool for language learning and teaching. We should pay close attention to the role of human body, social interaction, and affect in human language communication. Now, in the final section of my talk, I'd like to propose a communicative competence that I think important for the era of digital technology. As digital technology advances, our communication is increasingly carried out through a multimodal fashion. So when we read, for example, we often process prints along with audio and visual information. The boundary between verbal and nonverbal activities are getting increasingly fuzzy. So in light of this situation, communicative competence can be considered as competency that is necessary for multimodal communication. It is primarily through language, but not necessarily limited to language. So communicative competence for the digital era is a much broader concept than the traditional conceptualization of communicative competence. So this is what I would consider communicative competence for the era of digital technology. It includes a knowledge-based competence, which I called basic linguistic knowledge, and abilities to use language, focusing on 3 different aspects. So abilities to use language autonomously, abilities to use language socially, and abilities to use language creatively. So these abilities to use language include a wide range of cognitive, social, and social cognitive and affective factors. So much broader concept that the language assessment literacy has discussed. So these abilities to use language are not necessarily compositional, by the way. They focus on different aspects of our communicative abilities. Now, basic linguistic knowledge in foundational knowledge, so including knowledge of phonology, vocabulary, grammar, pragmatics, and so forth. So you may think about famous Canal and Swain's model of communicative competence. Their model was composed of 3 competencies: grammatical, sociolinguistics, and strategic competencies. So my conceptualization of basic linguistic knowledge is kind of overlapped with their grammatical and partially with sociolinguistic competencies, but it covers only the knowledge part. So language education at school traditionally has focused on developing this linguistic knowledge. The basic linguistic knowledge is important, but knowing language does not make you a sufficient user of the language. So students need to develop abilities to use language. The first of the 3 abilities of language use, called abilities to use language autonomously. They refer to abilities to manage and control your own language use. They include not only language processing, but also include cognitive and metacognitive processing. So internet suddenly provides us with enormous amount of information. So every day, you need to process a huge amount of linguistic information, but often along with multimodal information. So among such information, you need to select necessary information. You have to detect which is true information and which is fake information. In order to do so, you need to understand the intention of the writer, right? You need to comprehend and analyze information critically. The ability to think about language through language or metalinguistic ability is also included here. Well, after all, information is not knowledge, right? You have to work actively to make information into knowledge. So it is critical to be selective and strategic about using digital technology, because digital technology can be very useful, but potentially can hinder your language use. And importantly, the gaps among students who can use digital technology wisely and those who don't appear to be increasingly wider. So this eye tracking study conducted among Japanese college students indicates that the students with high proficiency in English tend to be good at skimming the entire text and fixate important parts, such as keywords in the text, while quickly going through unimportant parts. When nonverbal visual information is available in the text, as you can see the figures at the bottom, they quickly look through them and fixate relevant parts, but ignore irrelevant or not important parts. In contrast, the students with lower proficiency are not good at skimming through the texts. They access only the limited amount of information that they happen to access, and then cannot selectively make use of non-linguistic information. The next one is ability to use language socially. There are the abilities to use language for building social networks, both in virtual and physical spaces. In the increasingly digitalized world, we have more opportunities to construct knowledge and skills in social networks. So it is important to develop abilities to enhance knowledge and skills in time and distance-free interpersonal spaces, while at the same time in building useful networks. In digital space, you may need unique skills which may be different from the skills in the real physical world. For example, you need skills to efficiently communicate with AIs or communicate with others while using and differentiating multiple avatars depending on purposes. Now, in the US, people have to talk to AIs almost every day. At least that's what I feel. So if you want to make an appointment at the hospital or call a bank, you first need to talk to an AI, and then you will be connected to a human operator. So AI may say, sorry, I don't understand you. That real person would not say that. It sounds rude. But anyway, so communicating with AI can be an important ability. It may require some unique abilities, well, at least at this point, because AI is not as accommodating as real humans. The abilities to use language socially also include abilities not only understand others' thinking through linguistic information, but also to detect other people's emotion or to deepen empathy. The importance of developing abilities to work efficiently and collaboratively in interpersonal spaces can be seen in companies' job advertisement. According to Rios and colleagues, based on their analysis on 140,000 job advertisement in the US, the 21st century desired skills in labor markets are: number one, oral communication; number two, written communication; number three, collaboration. So in essence, that companies are looking for people who can be productive in communicating and collaborating with others. And that is different from desired qualification from the previous generations, like self-management skills or professionalism or leadership skills. They're more likely, the individual-based qualifications. So the desired abilities have been changed. The last abilities were the abilities to use language creatively. So they include the abilities to rebuild or reorganize existing knowledge, primarily based on the basic linguistic knowledge, or the abilities to apply existing knowledge in a new context, or the abilities to make use of multimodal information in addition to verbal information. So as mentioned, language education at school traditionally focuses on developing basic linguistic knowledge. Again, this is important. This is so important, but it will not be sufficient in the future. So what we want are the abilities to use language autonomously, socially, and creatively based on the basic linguistic knowledge. And all of these abilities, including the basic linguistic knowledge, are all connected and mutually influential. Well, this communicative competence is a working model. it needs refinement for sure. It is probably better to put it as a conceptualization of communicative competence rather than a model, because it is too vague and too holistic as a model. It is not testable, so it's not the warrant to be called a model. So I welcome any feedback on this conceptualization. It would be really, really wonderful if this conceptualization is an opportunity for people to start a conversation for future development of communicative competence. Now, to suggest the use of technology for language instruction in any concrete fashion is not easy because technology is changing rapidly. So here I just suggest a couple of examples for primary school students' classrooms. Now, teachers are encouraged to use tasks in classrooms nowadays, right? And sometimes you can ask children to design tasks by themselves. So in another talk that I'm going to give tomorrow, I will show you a digital game task designing project. In that project, I asked primary school students in Japan to design digital games for English vocabulary learning. Children incorporated various game elements that are considered important for language learning, such as giving constant feedback, visualizing learners' improvement, incorporating graded challenges, or having unexpected accidents, and so forth. Please join me tomorrow again if you're interested in digital games. But in any event, it is important to make use of the digital generation's knowledge and skills of technology in order to maximize the effect. Now, self-introduction is a very popular classroom activity for young learners, but it is not particularly an exciting activity, especially if the students already know their classmates, right? So you can change the format from face-to-face to video-based. Then the students feel like they engaged in a different task. So Anna Maria Pinta at Warwick University in UK reported that English learning children incorporated various visual and audio information in their videos. Well, they can show their creativity. If you allow them to upload their videos in a secured space, they can receive feedback from their peers and parents. So that led to their greater motivation. So a lot of children, autonomously or voluntarily, repeated the task in order to make their videos look better, right? So, empirical studies have shown that the task repetition is, found to be very effective. So in this case, you don't have to ask children to repeat the task. They do it voluntarily. So, and also you can make it as a pair work in order to facilitate their collaboration skills. Here's an example where making a self-introduction poster can be a creative and enjoyable activity. And the product can be used as an assessment even. Miss Sahashi, primary school teacher, a friend of mine, she kindly shared her classroom activity with me. So in this case, the students use Google Pages and created posters. The teacher actually utilized the students' activity in art class. So in art class, the students actually drew a self-portrait. And then in English class, the children first took a snapshot of their face. And Google Art and Culture identifies a famous portrait painting, which is the most resembled to you. That sounds really fun, doesn't it? So the children put their self-portrait along with a famous painting and created a poster, self-introduction poster. So they freely express themselves. The posters were shared among classmates and family members. This activity increased their sense of affirmation among children. Anyway, so there are many possibilities to incorporate digital technology in your classrooms. As a final note, I must add that there are some serious concerns when using digital technology as an instructional tool. One is, as I mentioned repeatedly, growing gaps among students in terms of the quality of ICT use. Well, thanks to GIGA School Concept Policy, the access has become less of an issue in Japan, but the growing gaps in the quality of ICT use remains a concern. So there are some students who can make use of digital technology wisely, but there are others who do not take full advantage from the technology. They may have negative outcomes in their academic studies, including language learning. So we need to come up with some plans to deal with this issue before it is going to be too late, before the gap gets too large. The second concern is ethical issue. So we can now collect a substantial amount of information about the students, right? So how much time they spend on tasks and homework, how much they pay attention to materials during the class. Say, we can actually use the eye tracking devices, or how much time they spend on discussion on the Zoom and chats. So we accumulate substantial personal information every day. But who owns such personal information? And in the near future, AI is going to analyze such educational related data. In fact, in some countries such as Poland and Malta in Europe, using blockchain, all the citizens' lifelong learning data is already centralized. So such data can be useful to improve instruction and other educational services, but we also have a series of ethical concerns. Again, who owns the data and who can access the data? Is security good enough? How are people's rights protected? Individual universities may develop their own ethical guidelines, but hardly anything has been done at the primary and secondary school levels. So it's desirable to have a common guidelines at the national level or even at the global level. In conclusion, in this talk, I propose that a language education in the era of digital technology is to connect language use and cognitive styles among the digital generation and communicative competence for the era of digital technology through using digital technology as a means of learning language. In using digital technology, I suggest that at least 3 important elements to consider: the role of human bodies, social interaction, and affect in language use. In other words, no matter how digital technology is advanced from now on, the role of parents and teachers over children's language development and use remains critical. That's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, a big thank you to our plenary speaker here. Let me get Mary up here. Let's see here, 1 second here. Yep, feel free to write in the chat there if you have comments or questions at all. There we go, let's get Mary in here.
I'm here. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Butler, for coming today. When we suddenly went online this year, a lot of things had to take place at a short notice, and you kindly agreed to come and be a panelist or be a speaker for us today at a very late notice. Thank you again so much.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Mary. Thank you, Dr. Butler. It was a really, really great talk. I know for myself, just from my own anecdotal evidence, I have an 11-year-old daughter, and if you compare the time she spends on YouTube versus she'll turn the TV on, the TV stays on for about 5 minutes or so, and then she immediately goes to her cell phone and starts flicking through her favorite YouTube channels and stuff. And I ask her, which do you want on, the TV or the, she said, oh no, you can watch the TV, but you turned it on. It's like, so yeah, she, and also her mind with graphics is amazing. Like she definitely remembers spatial things, and likes to see those, like the graphic interface, I think much, but at the same time, because she's also learning kanji, she really does like to write out the kanji, but that also has a pictographic kind of element to it. So she sees the shapes there. So I wonder if that is something as well that maybe Japanese students can focus on the graphics also and the text because of the pictographic elements. So, okay. So thank you very much. I just have